students' attention between language and content in an ongoing manner, okay? Instead of just saying, okay, now we're just doing content and we're not doing language, we actually want them to shift their attention, because shifting attention in this way increases what we call depth of processing. And depth of processing is what helps to anchor information in memory. So students are able to learn better if they're making connections during interaction between language and content. Now, because the point of counterbalance instruction is that attention to language is always, one draws attention to language always in a meaningful context related to a literacy theme or to subject matter instruction. And this means that students are learning language in context. We always say, okay, make sure they're learning language in context, and subject matter provides that context. And it's very different from decontextualized language instruction where there isn't a context. As I referred to earlier, teachers were observed separating language and content, and counterbalance instruction helps us to draw on language in meaningful context. And to answer the question about why we need it is because we know that so many language features simply aren't picked up through exposure, so they need some sort of instruction. But we also know that decontextualized instruction of language isn't as effective as a more contextualized kind of instruction. We also know that not every single language feature needs this kind of counterbalance instruction, because students do indeed pick up a lot of language. So counterbalanced instruction is really there for focusing on the language that they're not picking up. And a lot of it is, the morphosyntactic features in languages like Spanish and French that they're not picking up on. So it's not required for all language features, but for many language features, and we spell out in the book what kinds of language features need this kind of attention.
Yeah, so it's those ones that we know. If you've been teaching in immersion, it's the ones that you know. If you're still in third grade and they're still making that mistake, that's one of the features that you should try with a counterbalanced approach. Exactly. All right, off my soapbox. All right, so one more to push it further. So we need the counterbalanced approach, but can you explain what the CAPA model is and how it fits this counterbalanced instruction, how that is an example of counterbalanced instruction?
Right. So the CAPA sequence, so CAPA is an acronym that stands for CAPA. So it's contextualization, awareness, practice, and autonomy. Okay, that's the fourth phase. And this gives teachers one way to integrate language and content over an instructional sequence that consists of these four different phases. So in the first phase that we call contextualization, the emphasis is on content. So the bottom line is that if the question is, how do you integrate language and content? The answer is start with content. Don't start with the language. Contextualize your unit. One example I'm going to give, so the contextualization phase is where there really is an emphasis on input. Students aren't necessarily producing yet, but they're exposed, for example, to a very rich text that may contain multiple features that we want to focus on. Their frequency may have been increased, for example. So we start with a text. I'm going to give you an example as I go through each of these phases. I'm going to give you an example from a lesson to illustrate this. It's a lesson that was designed by teachers in grade 4 teachers in social studies. Their focus was on the voyages of Jacques Cartier, a French explorer who came to what was called New France, which is now Quebec. And their linguistic focus was the past tense in French, the passé composé. It's kind of like the preterite in Spanish, except it's a compound tense. So there's an auxiliary verb and a past participle. And the auxiliary is either the verb to be or to have. And students are always getting these mixed up. So the linguistic focus is what is the purpose? How do we use the passé composé to depict past tense events? And how do we know whether or not which auxiliary to use? So to start out with the contextualization phase, the teachers created a video that was time-lapse. They used a series of maps of the world to show the different voyages of Jacques Cartier. It was time-lapse so that it looked like an animated feature, and they created a voiceover describing the voyages and of course using multiple instances of the passé composé. So in the first phase, the focus is just on this. They're listening, they're watching the video, they're discussing it. As they discuss it, the teacher's using the past tense and the students are too, but the focus isn't on the language, it's just on the content. And then in the next phase, which we call awareness, the students are asked to start using their metalinguistic skills. They start, up till now, they haven't seen the text, they've only heard the text. Now they're looking at the text on an interactive white screen. And of course, the verb tenses have been highlighted. And so there's some metalinguistic discussion about what the verbs are that's highlighted, and they decide that it's the passé composé, and they start looking at which verbs take to be and which verbs take to have as an auxiliary. They start making lists of the different verbs. And so this section on awareness is a little bit more traditional in the sense that they're analyzing verbs in this particular text to increase their awareness. That's the purpose. And increasing students' awareness is never enough. We have to get them practicing. We need to get them using these forms. And so the next phase is called a practice phase. And the practice phase is really about guided practice, okay? In this particular case, in this social studies lessons, the students in each class received one of 5 different images that they had to annotate. They had to come up with a sentence using the proper verb tense describing the image that was related to one of the voyages. And then they had to mingle with other students in the class to find students with the same image. And then students with the same image together collaborated to come up with a really short narrative using the past tense and describing in some detail the event that was depicted in the image. And then they had to present their historical account orally to the class. And at that point, the teacher is giving them corrective feedback on verb forms, but also feedback on the content to make sure that they have the content right. So that in that phase, that's guided practice. But that's not enough either. We want to move them forward to more language production. And this is where it brings us to the autonomous phase, where they're a bit more autonomous in their language production, and there's a little bit less guidance from the teacher. And in this particular unit, following the social studies objectives, the students had to create a timeline of Jacques Cartier's voyages, and they worked collaboratively in small groups to literally depict a timeline. They had to discuss amongst themselves what they thought were the most important events. They produced they annotated and illustrated their timeline, which they then again presented to the class, which gave the teacher again an opportunity to provide feedback on both content and language. And then these timelines were depicted put up around the classroom. So the point here is that there's a progression, and this progression is based on SLA research, the idea of contextualizing, moving into an awareness phase, giving students opportunities to practice, and then helping them to become more autonomous, starting out with lots of input and then providing scaffolding throughout the sequence in order to allow them to produce the kind of output we want related to the academic content.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And we had some discussion in the chat about where to find reference to this in the book, and also wanted to let those of you who have been asking if there's going to be a recorded. We did turn, I think Dee turned the recording on. So it's not going to be the entire thing, but we will have some recorded there for those of you who are catching up in terms of the language. All right, so we're going to go back to Dee on this, and it's in part 3 of the book. It's devoted to scaffolding. You refer to it as being instrumental to help students understand and engage with language and content. What is scaffolding and how should it be used in content-based language teaching instructions?
Yeah, so in a nutshell, scaffolding refers to the different types of supports or assistance that teachers provide to help students understand and engage with the content that they're learning at levels that are higher than they'd be able to achieve on their own. Okay, so that's in a nutshell, that's what scaffolding is. And in the book, we draw on Echevarria, Vogt, and Short's classification of scaffolding as verbal, procedural, or instructional. And we take it a step further by sort of teasing out and describing ways that we scaffold for comprehension, which I think is more commonly known to teachers, and then ways that we scaffold for language production. So verbal scaffolding is really about how teachers use language to support students' comprehension and their language use. So when we're scaffolding verbally for comprehension, we're expressing the same message in multiple ways, like paraphrasing, using synonyms and multiple examples. And we're also talking about how teachers very naturally modify their speech. They modify their rate of speech, they slow down, how they articulate, what intonation they use to emphasize for students and so on, so that students can comprehend them. And they also accompany their speech with gestures and other nonverbal cues as well. So that's verbal scaffolding for comprehension. When it comes to verbal scaffolding for production, we're referring to how teachers use corrective feedback and how they follow up on student responses with questions to elicit even more language from students. So the goal is to push students to produce language, to produce more language, to clarify, to elaborate their ideas, and to get them to produce more sustained and complex language. And so Roy is going to actually talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. He'll talk a little bit more in depth about corrective feedback and questioning techniques. Procedural scaffolding, the next category, refers to classroom procedures, that is activity frames and routines that teachers use to ensure predictability and to facilitate comprehension through a second language, okay? And then, so for something like think, pair, share is a very typical classroom routine that kids learn very early on and they're able to do, and those are quick comprehension checks at the same time. Think, pair, share is also a productive activity where students are producing the language as well. So procedural scaffolding is also about creating routines and coming up with multiple opportunities for students to use the language. So putting students in pairs and in small groups, organizing activities like role plays and debates, and making sure that all of this is well scaffolded so that students can stay in the target language. They can stay in that second language. And then finally, instructional scaffolding is all about how teachers use print and multimedia resources and other tools to support learning. So instructional scaffolds for comprehension include things like graphs and props and maps and word walls and graphic organizers and so on. And then similar kinds of instructional tools can be used to scaffold for production, sentence starters or frames, having posters with key phrases displayed in the classroom and reminding students to use those scaffolds as they engage in group work, for example. So those are the kind that verbal, procedural, and instructional scaffolding for both comprehension and production means that there's lots of different ways to go about scaffolding, and those are the kinds of activities and techniques that we really emphasize in the book. So scaffolding is also talked about as being temporary support. But in immersion and bilingual classrooms, scaffolding for comprehension and production is really a key instructional strategy that's used from the very beginning of the program all the way through to the end. What changes is the nature of the scaffolding. as students acquire more language and become more independent. And we need to keep it, so we need to keep in mind that as students advance in grade level, right, the content becomes more demanding, and so does the language. It becomes more demanding linguistically for students. So scaffolding continues to be important, even when students have a lot of proficiency. In the past, I've used the metaphor of ocean tides to describe the ebb and flow of scaffolding in bilingual classrooms. So imagine at the beginning of a unit, when students are learning new concepts and they're being introduced to new language, you're going to have scaffolding that's much more prominent. So that tide is in, right? You're providing lots of support for students as they're just learning this new content and the new language that you're introducing them to. And then as the unit progresses, teacher scaffolding shifts, and you're trying to push students to be more reliant on language and more responsible for producing language. And so that's when the tide goes out, right? So it's really the, sort of this ebb and flow, but it's constant. It's something that you want to be present in the program from the beginning to the end, and you want strategies to shift depending upon the level that students have. One of the challenges that I see sometimes is when I'm in an upper grade classroom, I see teachers over scaffolding. They're just doing so much for the students that the students aren't being held responsible for learning and for really tapping into the language and using language. And so teachers need to learn how to wean students away from certain supports and really make sure that they are making them more reliant on language itself, rather than providing all of this extra support. And it's a balance that teachers need to learn to create as they teach.
So as part of the scaffolding in chapter 5, you elaborate in detail on teacher questioning techniques, sections like putting questions into questions and questions leading to pushed output. As an addition to this, I will say that I feel when we went through this in my first cohort of my French immersion teaching, this was definitely a weakness. Like they knew how to ask questions about content, but they did not know how to ask questions to scaffold the language. So can you give us an idea of what are some good questioning techniques, Roy?
Right. So the bottom line in questioning techniques is that we want to ask questions that push students in their output. Now, in the book, there's a section called Putting Questions into Question. And in that section, I actually did an analysis of myself as a teacher. I was a grade 8 French immersion teacher, and I had access to some video of myself that I transcribed. I actually thought I was asking really good questions. I had planned questions. We were studying a novel in which the main character had to flee from the police. He was wrongly accused of something and of stealing something, and he had to flee from the police and spent the night in a refuge all alone in this very dark and lonely place. And I asked my 13 and 14-year-old students, what was the main character feeling? Like, what would he be feeling in those circumstances, fleeing from the police and so on? I thought that was a good question, trying to get them to express the feelings of the main character. So they would answer things like, oh, he's sad. And I'd say, yeah, good idea. What about you? What do you think? I think he'd be afraid. Good. What about you? What do you think? So it just, there was no, what I should have been doing, the point here is that you need to make requests for elaboration, right? And what we know from research is that students do produce language, and it's often very short utterances. So if a student says, well, he'd be afraid, I need to say, well, tell me more about that. Like, what would he be afraid of, okay? And in fact, we know also from research that teachers, when they get an answer, will do that. They'll say, yes, good, next. And we're just sort of eliciting short answers from students. So we need to learn how to make elaboration requests. And there's a lot in the book suggesting how we do that. And the idea of asking for elaboration isn't only to get students to produce more output. First of all, we do know that by asking requests for elaboration, students do produce more complex language, which is what we want, but it also helps them to deepen their understanding, okay? So it has a twofold purpose: get them to use more complex language, and also help them to deepen their understanding. So the bottom line here is to not just plan the first phase of questions for your students, but to always be prepared to make requests for elaboration. Tell me more about that. How do you know that? And that is indeed difficult for teachers and requires some planning and some practice to do that, especially because at first, if students aren't used to that, they might just appear speechless because they're just used to giving their one very short one-word answers, right? And so we have to really train them that extended output is essential, okay?
Can I just add something to that? So something that corresponds in the US to the Common Core standards, and I'm not sure, do you use those in Louisiana?
Yeah.
Common Core? Yes.
We have our Louisiana standards, but we had to go to Common Core so that they wouldn't sue us for plagiarism, because they really are the Common Core standards, which is like a few little tweaks.
Okay.
It's
So
basically,
at any rate, you know, one of the Common Core standards is that kids need to be able to substantiate their perspectives based on information in the text. And so another really important follow-up question is, so you think that he was feeling sad? Where is it in the text that made you feel that way, that made you believe that he's sad, right? Or, oh, he's afraid. So let's see if you can point out the words in the text that show you that he was afraid. Yeah. So those are kinds of things that teachers can do to link really, really nicely with some of the literacy standards that we've got to meet. Yeah.
excellent. So going back to scaffolding, so we have the questioning, but then you also have the corrective feedback, which is, I think, one of the really powerful thing. Like, how do we get to the point where they're speaking immersion, right? They're not speaking French, they're not speaking Spanish, they're not speaking Mandarin, they're speaking immersion. So I think corrective feedback is really important in getting them not to speak immersion. So as part of that, you do a deep dive into that as a form of scaffolding. So why do you give so much attention to that in your book? Although I just think I just explained it. And then what are the different types of, like, it's so important. What are the different types of corrective feedback? Why don't we just go there? Because I think we all understand what happens when you don't give corrective feedback.
Right.
So,
Well, I love your enthusiasm, because I share your enthusiasm for the importance of corrective feedback. But I do want to say that one of the reasons that we do focus on it extensively in the book is because it gives teachers one way to integrate language and content. You can use corrective feedback while you're teaching subject matter, and you're automatically integrating a focus on language into your subject matter instruction. And the reason we focus on it so much is that it's not that easy to give feedback, especially in immersion classrooms, because of the focus on content. Young learners, we find, often don't see that the feedback is actually focusing on language. They think it has more to do with meaning. So teachers really need help in developing the right kinds of strategies. And again, one of the main strategies in feedback is the kind of feedback that pushes students in their output, okay? So, and we want to push students in their output without discouraging them. Sometimes teachers feel that if we give feedback, it's going to discourage learners. And I just want to say that there's a lot of research that shows that learners really actually want feedback. It's teachers who actually feel sometimes uncomfortable about it. And to not feel uncomfortable about feedback, you need to know about the wide range of feedback types. And so this is what we present in the book in some detail. There's been a lot of research in second language acquisition research in this area. And basically there are two main families of corrective feedback. So that one family is what we call reformulations, when you simply reformulate the correct phrase for the learner. And one of those types is called a recast. And this is a very frequent type of feedback. If a student says, yeah, last night I seen a good movie, a teacher might just say, oh, you saw a good movie. What was it? Okay, you just recast implicitly. And the problem with that is that it could be the case, if this happens frequently, students end up thinking that seed and saw are kind of synonyms, you know, because there's no negative response to seed. And so maybe they're similar. The other type of feedback is what we call prompting. And it's when you push students in their output, you push them to self-repair rather than giving them the right form. So you just give them some sort of clue or hint that something's wrong. So if a student says, last night I seed a good movie, you might say, you seed? Something like this, or you what? Some sort of negative feedback, but that allows them to pick up on it and move on with it. So you can only prompt, of course, if you know that students might know the right form. You can't prompt them to produce something they're not ready to produce. But what has been found in research is that teachers use recasts so often. And what this means is that the teachers are doing the work for the students. And because we want students to become more autonomous and to produce more language, it makes more sense to push them to self-repair. And there's also some research that suggests that if you prompt students sufficiently, they will become more aware of their own language use and begin to self-correct themselves even before the teacher gives feedback. And this can be seen as the main goal of corrective feedback, training learners to self-correct, okay? Now, the problem is that teachers need to be very selective. It's not a problem, it's a challenge, because we're not suggesting that teachers need to correct all the errors, because that would be a complete disaster, somewhat impossible. Teachers wouldn't be happy, students wouldn't be happy. So it's all about selective correction. And some research has shown that immersion teachers can correct up to about, say, 60% of students' errors online. Well, online, by online, I mean in real time. And this is what we really promote in the book, is getting teachers to reduce their use of constant recasting and feeling comfortable in pushing students in kind and supportive ways to self-repair on their own.
Yeah, and that's really good executive functioning if you can self-repair, which is,
absolutely,
imagine how much that would help them in their lives.
Exactly.
Just having that general skill. Right. So Dee, the final question is for you. So part 4 of your book covers unit and lesson design, biliteracy development, as well as assessment. There's not enough time to go into all of this, but could you give us sort of a brief summary of what our readers can look forward to, or how they might benefit from these chapters?
Yeah, so immersion teachers really have to develop skills to create curriculum that integrates language and content, and at times culture as well. No published curricula do that well. You know, none of the materials that we have at our disposal in these immersion programs do that well. And so our approach to curriculum development is really about how to integrate content and language, and like I said, when appropriate, culture as well. And we follow Wiggins and McTighe's backward design model, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but the idea is to begin with the end in mind. That is, start with the final assessment you would have at the end of a unit, and then you plan backwards to make sure that the overall unit design is really preparing students for that final assessment. And the assessment, I'm jumping ahead here, but the assessment really needs to be something that's meaningful, performance-based, similar to something that's sort of real life kinds of things that we want kids to engage in. So at any rate, going back to curriculum development, so we introduce a lot of planning templates. If you were to look at page 191, for example, in the book, you'll see that there's a unit design template provided there. And by the way, any page in the book that has this little icon here of a page means that you can reproduce it without copyright permission, okay? And so you'll find templates like this, really extensive templates for unit design, for lesson development, and so on. The module and lesson design one is right after page 205, so page 206, 207. And at any rate, these templates are very detailed, and then we have detailed descriptions that go about how to develop well-integrated units and lessons, and we illustrate these concepts constantly with teacher-made examples. And in fact, throughout the book, we incorporate multiple examples developed by teachers that we worked with over the years, and we call those teacher spotlights. So really, curriculum development is difficult work. It requires a lot of a concentration and a lot of skill, and these chapters are intended to help teachers develop the knowledge and skill they need to do that. As I was mentioning, when it comes to assessment, we really emphasize performance-based assessment, and we take teachers through the process of developing assessments that integrate content and language with 3 interrelated tasks: one that's focused on comprehension, one that's focused on communicating to an audience, and one that's focused on engaging in interpersonal communication, because the language shifts for each 3 of those different ways of using language, right? And so the tool that we use is called the Integrated Performance Assessment, and it's based on an assessment model that was developed by individuals connected to ACTFL, the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, and it was really developed for a more of a traditional world language or foreign language classroom, but we've modified it for our purposes for being appropriate for the immersion context. And so the curriculum and assessment chapters in that final section, so that would be chapters 7, 8, and 10. They take teachers through these step-by-step procedures to write good content and language objectives, to design activities that bring a focus on language during content instruction. We return to the CAPA model and use that as a way to frame connected lessons so that you are contextualizing language that students are going to be introduced to, and so on. When I worked with teachers following these step-by-step procedures that we describe in the book, the planning for integration became easier for them, and it became to feel quite natural to plan content lessons with attention to language. And most importantly, as teachers begin to do this, they really observe progress in their students as a result. And that really motivates them to engage in this kind of planning. But I will emphasize, this kind of planning requires a lot of knowledge and skill, and actually teachers would benefit from being connected to a professional development class to sort of take them through this, so that you have somebody providing feedback along the way as they're learning to develop units and so on. In fact, I'm just in about a week and a half, we start our new semester, and the course that I'm teaching is on part 4 of the book, except for the biliteracy development. That's a different chapter. So at any rate, again, the final section also includes this chapter on biliteracy development, and it's here where we introduce the teachers to make those cross-lingual connections while maintaining separate spaces for the 2 languages. And that was what Roy was talking about earlier with the bilingual read aloud projects that they engaged in Montreal, and so on. And we also in that chapter just talk about some techniques to really support literacy instruction, because sometimes you're just going to be doing literacy instruction in the particular language that you're teaching in, and then sometimes you're going to be focused more on a biliteracy approach where you're trying to help students make connections across their languages. So the chapter really focuses on both of those things. And what we do in chapter 4 is it's really all about planning. I think chapter 4 is really more about planning, and part 4 is really about planning and making sure that the teachers have the skills that they need to really plan for teaching language beyond vocabulary, going beyond vocabulary, and making sure you're bringing a focus on language as you teach your academic content.
All right, well, I would like to thank our panel for joining us. And they're going to be giving a question answer about the book in a little while. We're going to take a little break, but before we take the break, we do have 2 door prizes for those of you who are here, must be present to win. In order to give them away, I need Roy to give me a number between 1 and 92 and Dee to give me a number between 1 and 92. Oh, we have, one of the things is we have an Appeli kit, which is a French kit on teaching literacy. Segue, nice segue. A whole kit, which is going to be nice. And we have the creator of the kit who will be presenting in breakout session 1. And then we also have Beausoleil books. They have books in French and in Spanish and in Mandarin, and so through their bookshop online. So we have a $25 gift certificate to them as well. So we'll get the numbers. I will chat to the 2 people who get it after this. But other than that, we have a break. So go ahead and give us a number between 1 and 92. Roy, what number do you have?
27.
27. And Dee?
68.
68. Okay, so 27, 21, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is Veronica Guevara. So Veronica, if you can message me with your email and let me know if you're a French teacher, because the Appeli is only in French. And then the other number 68, 60, this is going to be one of our calc issue teachers, because that's on the second page of that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Jihan Young. So let me know if you're both Spanish. If you're both Spanish, we'll make it the 2 Beausoleil then, and we'll do the 2 Appeli. We'll do Appeli later on. So we have more than that. So we'll have 2 Beausoleil. So when you go to the vendors at 2 o'clock, go ahead and we'll just send me your emails, and we'll make sure that we get you your Beausoleil books gift certificate. All right, so 15-minute break. We're gonna come back at 11:15, go get some coffee, do whatever, and then we get to ask questions. Yay. All right, thank you all so much, and I'm gonna go get some coffee.